Welcome to In Focus with Ijaz here. As wildfires rage on 4 continents, the United Nations panel on climate change issued a dire warning on Monday, saying global warming was dangerously close to being out of control and blamed humans unequivocally for it. The report from scientists of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere are high enough to guarantee climate disruption for decades, if not centuries. Simply put, the deadly heat waves, gargantuan hurricanes, and other weather extremes that are already happening will only become worse. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres described the report as code red for humanity. Drawing on more than 14,000 scientific studies, the IPCC report gives the most comprehensive and detailed picture yet of how climate change is altering the natural world and what could still be ahead. In 3 months' time, the UN COP26 climate conference in Glasgow will try to get a consensus from state parties for more ambitious climate action and the money to go with it. To discuss the worsening climate situation, I'm joined this evening by Dr. Monica Emelko, who is Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Canada Research Chair in Water Science, Technology and Policy at Waterloo, Dr. Fahd Saeed, who is a climate scientist and regional lead for South Asia and Middle East, and Dr. Adil Najam, inaugural Dean of the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. Thank you to my panelists. Let me begin with Professor Emelko here. I was just sort of scanning through frankly, the executive summary, and that was enough to give me the shivers. It seems to me that, for all our talk about internal fissures in states and interstate rivalries and economic meltdowns and the rest of it, what is really probably going to determine the future of mankind or humankind itself is going to be the climate.
I agree with you entirely. We have this hopeful feeling about us, and we should remain hopeful, but really, we are in a position where we're looking to mitigate, to adapt, not to prevent at this point in time. When I think about the cascading impacts of changing climate, people tend to think about the immediacy, about the natural disasters that are exacerbated by changing climate. But yet there's been very little discussion about the cascading impacts, the domino effect, if you will, of those disturbances. And it's really those things that contribute to the longevity, the long-term impacts that we will be living with. Not that we might be living with, but that we will be living with for decades to come. And in my own area, my biggest concern is about basic life, how we live, and the safety of water.
Right. Let me pull in Fahd Saeed here and talk about a paradox. Now, I would like you to sort of explain for the laypersons what exactly this means. Now, the report is talking about, the emissions that have pushed the average global temperature up by 1.1 Celsius from its pre-industrial average and would have raised it to 0.5 Celsius further without the tempering effect of pollution in the atmosphere. So this basically means, ironically, that even as societies move away from fossil fuels, temperature will be pushed up again by the loss of the airborne pollutants that come with them and currently reflect away some of the sun's heat. So, damned if you do, damned if you don't.
So, as you mentioned, that we have wasted some precious time in the past decades and trying to convince people, the policymakers, the economies with the polluting economies, basically. And the irony is that the countries who are historically responsible for all these mess, and today they are more resilient as compared to the global South, who are not historically responsible for this mess. But at the same time, this year we have seen these series of events happening in the developed world, and they are not withstand with all that the fury of the nature. So that is the point which this report tried to highlight, and on top of it, it also has the message that we don't have enough time to waste. Of course, there are people and there are very sane voices who say who are of the view that we should adapt, we should go for the adaptation right now, and we are already too late. Yes, we are too late, but there is still a light at the end of the tunnel which says that if we do something, if we try to do something, or in other words, with the total amount of emissions we have in the atmosphere, we are yet not committed to 1.5 degrees centigrade. But if we keep on emitting the way we are emitting right now, we'll be hitting this 1.5 degrees centigrade, the magic number coming from Paris Agreement, somewhere in the next decade. So this is the time, and the COP26 around the corner. This is the time the countries should come up, the developed countries, not only by reducing their emissions, but also providing financial capacity building and the technological transfer support to the developing countries.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Faz Saeed speaking with us. Dr. Adil Najam, lots of people have been sounding the alarm bell for a fairly long time. You have personally done a lot of work with reference to Pakistan and South Asia. But the issue is that somehow we're still very far from developing a consensus. It might be an aberration, but frankly, as you know, the former US President Donald Trump threw a big spanner in the works. Somehow he was not convinced that there is a scientific basis to this looming crisis, this emergency. So the issue is not just technical and scientific, it's also political. So give us a sense of how that can be overcome.
Thank you, Jaz. You're exactly right. The issue is political. The issue is societal. Issue has been societal. The science is clear. The science has been clear. So the report we're talking about, the IPCC, is the 6th report of the IPCC. I was a lead author for the 3rd and 4th reports of the IPCC way back, more than a decade ago. They gave the Nobel Award to the IPCC for clarifying the science. And by that, what I mean is that the science has been clear. In fact, what this report says is exactly the same that the last report said, is exactly the same that the report before that said. There are details on the science that have become more clear, but the essential message is we've messed up. The essential message is this is inevitable and this is irreversible at this point. At this point, what you can do is manage, but no longer being able to reverse. And about the IPCC, I should say this, and this is how to read and understand why this is important. It's not just the science. The IPCC is an inherently conservative body. It is hundreds of scientists around the world. When they come to consensus, it is always going to be at the most careful level. Right? So what they're doing is they're looking at all the science and saying, what is it that we can all agree on? Which means that when they say that we are doomed, they are being careful. And for those not in the IPCC like myself, I think it is much worse than that. Now, on the politics, yes, Mr. Donald Trump sort of in his ways did as you said, but he's not the only one. The fact of the matter is that politicians, particularly in developing countries, whether it is the current US administration, which does say a better game, and I do think they kind of believe it. But in action, whether it is the US, whether it is the UK, whether it is Canada, whether it is the EU, whether it is even developing countries, politicians have not and policymakers have not acted at the speed. And the reason for that, if you ask, is a fairly simple one. Just till now, we have been convinced that this is a future problem. Therefore, it was easy for you and me to kick it down the road, think when it will come, we will spend a lot of money and somehow do it. If there is a message in this IPCC report, it is this is not a future problem. If you live in Karachi and you went through that heat wave, this is not a future problem. If you are in California or in Canada and living in smoke, this is not a future problem. If you are in Australia, or if you are in Delhi, or if you are in Germany, or if you are in Greece fleeing the fires, this is no longer a future problem. So in many ways, what developing countries have been figuring out for the last 10, 15 years, because we are more vulnerable and on the cutting edge, that this is here, this is now. One sentence, because I don't want to be depressing, there isn't a silver lining to this. This is, we messed up as a species at our richest, wisest moment. We messed up because this was a solvable problem. This is still a problem that can lead us towards solutions. Now, whether that is through renewables and electric vehicles and better buildings in mitigation, or in adaptation through better agriculture, through better cities, which will have a benefit in itself. It is not the cost argument that you asked, Monica. I would contend is not so. The money is there. Yeah, I don't believe that the money is not there. 100 billion a year is the number that the Paris Agreement set, which was not produced. I don't want new targets from Glasgow. I just want previous promises to be met. But 100 billion sounds a lot. But remember what we did with COVID. We found in a week $1 trillion and spent in 2 weeks $1 trillion. So when we believe the crisis is real, the money can come. And this is saying this crisis is real.
Right. So you're saying we're still not convinced. We still think it's a future problem. And obviously, I also talked about the wildfires. And I'm going to return to that problem shortly. But it's interesting that you said that we've done this at our richest moment. But paradoxically, it was going to happen at the richest moment because we have exploited nature in accumulating this knowledge and this wealth. We've basically exploited nature in ways that were never sustainable. But stay with me. I'm also joined by Dr. Derek Kanakis, who's Associate Research Professor, Division of Earth and Ecosystem Sciences at Desert Research Institute in Reno, Nevada. Dr. Kanakis, we were talking about, before you joined us, we were talking about the fact that the IPCC report, and as Dr. Adil Najam mentioned, is not the first one, it presents a very bleak picture of where we are headed. We also talked about the fact that a lot of this is also political because the science is very clear. So essentially, it seems that the most important thing that we have to overcome, and 3 months down the line is going to be the COP26 in Glasgow, is to actually get our politics right.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. The issue with climate change, particularly around mitigation, less so adaptation, is being able to solve that collective action problem, that all individual nations have the incentive to continue to use what are essentially cheaper fossil fuels. And as we continue to be competitive in the world economy, we're seeing each individual country want to continue to use its dirty coal and fossil fuels, while we're also all bearing the cost of that. So it's both the political will, and then I would also suggest a little bit of the technology and getting that policy fix right. Those are tricky things to do. Remember, we're talking not just about a pollutant, we're talking about the source of our energy systems, and that was never going to be something easy to change.
Right. So how does that work? Like, for instance, in Pakistan recently, the government has actually incentivized the electric vehicle imports by waiving off the duties. The Prime Minister has been going around actually leading the forestation campaigns. But as another panelist had pointed out, a lot of this problem is actually the problem of the developed countries that is now being dumped onto the lesser developed countries. So a lot of that responsibility lies on the developed countries. So now we've seen recent floods in Germany, we've got these wildfires. Do you think that is something which is going to sort of create a sense of urgency and emergency in the developed world with reference to tackling this?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely correct. There's enormous distributional consequences about who's caused the problem itself, what the source is. And remember, it's not just where we are today, it's the emissions over the last 100 years or so that whole industrialization period. Now, it is worth pointing out that our biggest emitter today, while historically it has been the United States, currently our biggest emitter is China. So there is a role of these rapidly industrializing countries also in what those future emissions are going to look like. So the building of new plants. So it's not quite as simple, unfortunately, of just looking at the developed versus the developing world. The developing world wants access to cheap energy. The developed world has had that access and certainly benefited from it. Now, the impact of the climate impacts are distributed, as your other guest mentioned, in multiple places in multiple ways. Most analysis does suggest that that burden, that heaviest burden, and those biggest human costs are going to be in the developing world, just because there's less capacity to deal with and more difficult to adapt. And then importantly, most individuals in the developing world are more closely linked to a lot of the natural resources systems that are going to be affected. So if fisheries get damaged or agriculture gets damaged, we have things like crop support systems in the US and Western Europe that will ensure some of those temporary short-term losses. Now, if we're going to actually have an impact, we need to look at the entire supply of energy within a system. So keep in mind some of our most forward-looking European countries in terms of using renewables and sustainability internally, such as Finland and others, are still utilizing fossil fuels and still exporting those. So similarly, China, which has a very robust and very active renewable energy growth, is building coal plants in other countries. It's part of its economic model is to have that industrial growth and those industrial partners. So we need to look at that energy infrastructure system that's in place, and we need to be able to respond both today and then make sure that we're building the right types of facilities into the future.
Absolutely. That was Dr. Derek Kanakis speaking with us. Professor Melko, before the industrial age, we certainly had the know-how in terms of realizing that everywhere that Homo sapiens expanded, they also simultaneously destroyed a lot of what existed in nature. Now, going by that knowledge, I want to ask you, when did the realization set in that the kind of riches that we were and exploiting nature and the riches that we were accumulating, through the industrial age, when did we realize that, we will ultimately end up getting into a mess?
I think that's a really great question, because you could answer that in a couple of different ways. I frankly believe that every generation, it's about every 30 years or so, we rediscover a variation on this same concept. It's one of the discussions that goes on is, we trade things off. This perspective of destruction is a relative one. So we've talked a lot about fires, for example, and fires, people can see the damage that they do to the landscape. But often people don't look at what happens after fire on the landscape. They don't realize that certain trees need that fire, that heat, that destruction, in fact, to proliferate. So I think that one of these discussions that we're getting into is about trade-offs and perspectives. It's the lens through which we look at the impacts and the consequences of what is happening. Even if we talk about this pristine state, let's take people off the planet. It's not static. It's dynamic. There is what we would describe as destruction. So the idea is, how do we interact with nature and how do we minimize the longer term damage? And the whole issue with climate change is that historically this planet has existed in this range, this envelope of natural variability. Warmer years, colder years, wetter years, drier years. But human activity in the last several decades has pushed us outside of that envelope. And now we're getting to extremes that when we talk about them being reversible or irreversible, we have to remember that we're talking about irreversibility in our lifetimes, in our children's lifetimes. But in the lifetime of the planet, it will come back. The problem is, are we willing to wait that long for it? And of course, the answer is no. So we have really, really pushed ourselves to these extremes. And the greater concern is if we don't act, if we go beyond 1.5, then the question will be, we sort of have an idea of what we might experience, but we don't know the full extent. And again, we see the immediacy, the impacts, the floods. And yes, we know there are costs in the short term to try to live in that type of environment. But going back to this discussion, the costs are much, much greater than that long term. We're getting to a point now as we look at these landscapes with fires that historically forests have grown back. But now we're at a point that we're terrified because we're having fire on top of fire, and there's not enough time for regeneration of the landscape. And that could take us to a very different landscape that we've not seen, and that is very difficult not only for the general public to imagine, but for scientists to imagine as well.
That's a great way of looking at it. Dr. Adil Najam, Professor Melko's idea of the dialectic between destruction and rebirth is fascinating. But my issue is that we as a species have tried to dominate everything. We've our exploitation is essentially about a sense that we can conquer everything. And I'm not trying to be melodramatic here. I'm just saying that that's the historic fact. That's how we've kind of gone about doing business here, and perhaps not realizing soon enough that there's going to be a pushback from this planet, from nature itself. And as Professor Melko said, the planet could be reborn, but by then we might not be there.
No, just exactly. At one level, you're exactly right. I say the same thing, and we all sort of, essentially the battle was between species and this great planet. So all of our language, our words was about conquering, right? You conquer the ocean, you conquer mountains, you place your flags. That is because the great force was the planet and these planetary forces, and we were a tiny, piddly little species. Well, the species grew, and as we grew, we got these muscles that we don't know how to use. And we have been burning our way to so-called progress in a way where we are not only just affecting the planet, we are affecting other species. Right? This is not just about fires. We are a very selfish species. So we get worried because the fire hurts me. I know, I'm being melodramatic too. But what the fire is also doing is making other species extinct. Now, Monica is exactly right. I would 100% agree. The planet is not in danger. We are in danger. Our preeminence as a species is in danger. The planet will be fine. It was fine before us. It will be fine after us. The arrogance of thinking we are the center of the universe is being questioned. But this is not just a question of the species doing it. This is where your earlier speaker, Derek, I would take some argument with him. This is not about everyone. This is about justice. The fact is, some in our species have contributed more. You, Ijaz, and me, who might drive, have contributed more than those who cannot. And the fact is that the results are also not equal. The poor get to pay for our sins. The 1.5 is a very real number. A lot of countries will be disturbed, but will get by 1.5. If you are in Russia, if you're in Canada, 1.5 might be uncomfortable, but you will survive. But if you are a small Pacific island, if you are Bangladesh, if you are parts of Pakistan, 1.5 is existential. It is as existential as another country coming and trying to conquer you. So this is not just a efficiency or economic problem, it's a justice problem. Right? The China number he gave is facetious. And I think a lot of my friends, climate scientists, keep talking about countries. China's emissions per capita are still half of the US. That doesn't mean China has to also, there's no problem. China has to reduce. But this equation between a country of 300 million and 1.2 billion, in terms of emissions, kinds of says it's someone else's problem. Yesterday, Mr. Kerry, the US representative of the president, and he's a wonderful person. I think his heart is exactly in the right place. He tweeted that, with the report that this is a global problem and countries must all come and act together. And my immediate response was, yes, so what is stopping you? right? The fact is, it's not like the Bangladeshis and the Pakistans can reverse, but it is like that the Europe, the China, the US, the Canadas can, and they have not. In that, it is a global justice problem in the politics. So kicking it down the road in the name of science is going to be existential. One sentence again, and Monica is exactly right. The key word is irreversible. We are used to crises. We just went through COVID. But COVID, you put a lot of money and then you got a jab. There is not going to be a vaccine for climate change.
Yep. Absolutely.
That is what irreversible means.
Absolutely. It's been a great discussion. Before I close this segment, just to corroborate what's been discussed so far, one of the co-authors, Tamsin Edwards, the IPCC report, the climate scientist at King's College London, said we are now committed to some aspects of climate change, some of which are irreversible for hundreds to thousands of years. But the more we limit warming, the more we can avoid or slow down those changes. Let's hope we can actually get the politics of this right, because as all my panelists said, the science is very clear about what's happening and what's likely to happen. Thank you so much to Professor Monica Melko for her insights. Thank you also to Dr. Adil Najam for his insights. We shall take a short break and return to discuss Saudi-Iran relations and where they stand. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Iran and Saudi Arabia, bitter regional rivals competing for influence in the Middle East and the Levant, had begun talking. Efforts that began early this year resulted in meetings in Baghdad in April. Since then, several rounds have been held, and lately, there have been unofficial reports that the venue of talks was moved to Oman. Over the past few weeks, no updates have been given on the latest status of the talks, but Iran has hinted at their continuation. Iran's new conservative president, Ebrahim Raisi, even invited a Saudi representative to his inauguration. Riyadh, reports suggest, spurned the invite. Has something changed from when rounds of talks were being held and the two sides were discussing a range of issues of concern? To discuss this, I'm joined by Mohammed Al-Kubaban, who's a Saudi Gulf Affairs expert, and Dr. James Devine, Associate Professor at Mount Ellison University and Head of the Department of Politics and International Relations. Let me begin with General Al-Kubaban. General, why did the Saudis spurn the invite to the inauguration ceremony? As I said in my opening, has something changed?
I didn't think so. There is a lots of changes, but regarding to go to Iran and attend the inauguration, since I knew our leadership, they don't participate in such a things like this. But anyway, maybe UAE, they congratulated Mr. Raisi for being the new government president. And regarding the change between the two governments, as you mentioned in your early talks here, there is some several speech, and it's top classified for any reason. I don't know why they're not at least announcing, though the Iraqis governments talked about that they held a few meetings between the Saudis and the Iranis. But for us as a media people, and we were watching, there is no real official talk from the both governments. Though I think the speech the speech Mr. Raisi talked when he been nominated as a president was welcoming the peace, welcoming that they can talk. And I think they tend for the Saudi governments really to work with their neighbors. And we saw last speech, Mr. Prince Mohammed talked about that we want to have a peace with all countries. So I think there is a signals or there is a messages between the two leaders. But I think so the evidence or what we saw on field or what we saw on ground, it doesn't reflect as the way they are talking.
Right. So the report suggests, the several rounds of talks that I talked about. As a matter of fact, the Iraqis were facilitating it, and the Qataris were also very interested in these talks. And there was a sense that, the issue of Yemen was being discussed, Iraq and Syria were also being discussed, as was Lebanon. But it seems that both sides, as I said in my opening, are keeping any progress or lack thereof under wraps. So what is your information with reference to what was being discussed and whether there was any breakthrough?
You knew, sir, that the Mr. Raisi, he met, I think, with the Houthis leader or with the spokesman of the Houthis party. So that's a signal by itself to the Saudis that the Iranian people are still not going with the Saudi initiative. You remember that the Saudis initiative had a very good chance for the Yemenis to stop the war and sit and talk. But what we saw and what we've been watching, that the Yemenis very soon, I mean, a few days ago, they've been firing long-range weapons to the Saudis. That's one thing. And we already discussed this in your program and other medias, that the Iranians will keep supporting, according to their constitute, supporting, as they said, the poor Muslims, or the Muslims need the support. This is one. The nuclear deal, I think it plays a big role in such a progressing the negotiation between the two countries. You knew the Iranians are still insisting to have their long-range weapons, and unfortunately, they're moving it to either Nasrallah in Lebanon or to the Houthis in Yemen, and also to the Hashd al-Sha'bi back in Iraq. So this is also threatening the Saudis. And what I see, the progress is very slow. I'm not optimistic that much that there will be no talk, but I think there should be more messages. And by the way, there will be, I think, somewhere next month, the Iraqi president sent his prime minister, foreign affairs minister, to have a meeting with the Iraqis neighboring countries. The Saudis should be there. He gave a message to Prince Faisal bin Farhan, welcoming King Salman to visit Baghdad. So I think the Iraqis are doing excellent in their job, trying to at least to work and settle down in the area. It's a hard work, but I think that if neighboring countries more cooperate with each other mainly, I think there will be, we'll see, inshallah, a lot of progress, but it will take some time.
Right. James Devine, a long-time watcher, observer, analyst of this area, Iran and the Middle East. Now, it seems to me, going by what the Iranians do in terms of their realpolitik or their sort of power projection in the greater Middle East, through proxies over wide geographies. And also, the general talked about the nuclear deal. It doesn't appear to me that the Iranians are going to make any kind of compromises with reference to their missiles and with reference to their push in the Middle East. So I don't know. I mean, as you know, the talks are stalled there also. So give me your sense of what can actually come off these back channel talks, and whether there's been any progress at all.
Well, it is hard to say what kind of progress has been made at this point, because as we've already heard, both sides are saying very little about it. The Iranians have officially acknowledged the talks are going on, although Saudi Arabia hasn't. But at this point, I think we're in a situation where the two countries are really the initiative is kind of stalling a bit because of other things, and it's important to remember that what's happening between Iran and Saudi Arabia is many ways captive to what else is happening in the region. So even if Saudi Arabia and Iran are quite committed to finding some sort of accommodation in the region, a lot of it is going to depend on things that are outside of their outside of that immediate relationship. And of course, the JCPOA talks are the chief thing. If there is no successful conclusion to those talks, it is going to be very difficult for Saudi Arabia and Iran to maintain any sort of diplomatic progress. And similarly, I mean, also the situation in Yemen. We frequently think of the Houthis in Yemen as simply as an extension of Iranian foreign policy, but they have their own politics and their own agenda. And right now, what's happening is there's a stalemate in Yemen. Neither side seems to be able to make a breakthrough, particularly in the fighting around Marib. And until that is settled, it's going to be difficult to make any progress in Yemen. And Yemen is probably the first domino in any sort of talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Saudis are certainly going to want to see some sort of help solving the Yemeni situation. And after that, things such as Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, those things will start to become more possible. It'll be more possible for those things to be addressed. But until the Yemeni situation is dealt with, I think that's going to have to wait.
That's a very important point, that the Houthis are not only without agency, and obviously they, given local politics and other pushes and pulls, that they have their own agenda also. But James Devine, there's another thing with reference to the sort of jockeying for influence. By all indications, frankly, it seems that Iran has largely won that contest, whether it's with reference to Iraq, Qatar, or Syria, or Lebanon, or even Hamas. And these are gains that it seems to me that Tehran is unlikely to lose unless there is some kind of quid pro quo plus, which is so great that, it might get Tehran to have a rethink in terms of, at least finding some kind of modus vivendi with Saudi Arabia. Is that something that you would agree with?
I think yes, they've made gains in the region which they're unlikely to give back. Not so much because of the Saudis, I think more because of Israel and the United States. And this is one of the important things to remember about the Iranian-Saudi rivalry is it's embedded within these other two rivalries, within the rivalry with the United States and with Israel. So in order to maintain its security vis-a-vis these two other states, Iran feels like it needs to have position in the region. It needs to have proxies. It needs to have the ability to retaliate against the United States and Israel through groups like Hezbollah or Hamas. To a lesser extent, but also Islamic Jihad in Palestine. This is Iran's asymmetric strategy for deterrence. Unfortunately, in terms of the Saudis, these are exactly the sorts of things which make the Saudis feel vulnerable. So as the Iranians continue their rivalry with Israel and the United States, which looks like it's going to continue, even if there is a new JCPOA, those rivalries are going to continue, which means they're going to maintain those positions, which means there's going to continue to be tensions with Saudi Arabia. The question is not whether Iran is going to give back those gains, is whether it's going to be able to reassure Saudi Arabia that its intentions are not directed primarily towards Riyadh.
All right. Now, you talked about the JCPOA. Let me get your take on that. Assuming that there is one, assuming also that, the U.S., for some reason, accepts the fact that, the sunset clause with reference to the Iranian missiles, lots of observers say that, from a technical point of view and a scientific point of view, Iran now has been enriching uranium over 68%. And they've got new centrifuges, and all of this activity is actually giving them the know-how to enrich it to weapons grade. And so one of the critics say that those who don't want want the U.S. to go back into this deal, they're saying, well, it's going to work entirely to the advantage of Iran, and it's not going to work in favor of the United States because Iran presumably will have the sanctions lifted, and at the same time having acquired the know-how so it's going to be one key turn away from being able to get a bomb.
The longer we go without an agreement, Iran is getting closer to that position where it will have all of the pieces in place where it can very quickly put together a nuclear weapon. There's a couple of things to keep in mind, though. First of all, some of the claims that Iran has been making about 60% enrichment or 60% plus enrichment and its newer, faster centrifuges have to be taken with a grain of salt. They may be able to enrich some uranium at 60%, but how much is a big question still. And it's not clear exactly how many of the faster how much of the faster enrichments they can actually engage in, or centrifuges, excuse me. And part of this is Iran itself, right? Because Iran is trying to put pressure on the United States. So what they're doing is saying, look, we're making all this progress. If you don't stop us quickly, it's going to be too late. This is a bargaining tactic in many respects. So that's something to keep in mind. So we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves in terms of Iranian actual capacity. The second thing is, even if this is becoming true, what are our alternatives? If we don't have a deal with Iran on the nuclear issue and we just let things continue, we're likely to see escalation. Both the United States and Israel have been quite clear that they don't want Iran to get to the position where they're going to be able to build a weapon. So what does that leave them? Use of military force, more disruptions in the Persian Gulf. So a deal may not be a great outcome and solve all the problems that we've been dealing with, but it's maybe the best of the possible outcomes.
I agree with you, but James Devine, as you know, there's a shadow war going on between Iran and Israel even as we speak. Whether it's the tankers, whether it's the former Mossad chief Yossi Cohn actually talking about Natanz and how they destroyed part of the plant and, the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh and the rest of it. So it seems to me that that particular war, with or without a deal, is going to continue. But thank you so much. That was Dr. James Devine. Thank you also to General Mohammad Al-Kubaiban for speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.